Our next session highlights what potential the Middle East entrepreneurial community presents and how various stakeholders can support entrepreneurs to take advantage of these opportunities. Please, I'd like to ask you guys in helping me welcome on stage former Prime Minister of Estonia, Mr. Tavvi Roivas. Joined by Ms. Areije Shakar, Director and Fund Manager, Al-Wahda Fund. And Mr. Hattaf Ansari, co-founder of Ampliphi Ventures. Joined by Mr. Travis Hunter, Associate Director of MIT Sloan Global Programs. And finally, this session will be moderated by Ms. Eman and Mahmoud, Strategy and Partnership Management of Sheraa.
Okay, great. So first of all, let me start by introducing the topic of ecosystem building and why it was really important for us in Sheraa to actually have a session that is dedicated to that. Originally, when we first started the center a couple of years ago, we were very focused on running programs, accelerators, ideation programs, and then the more that we ran it, the more that we realized that there were huge gaps in the ecosystem that we needed to plug ourselves to ensure the success stories are translating the way that we want them to. So the role and the scope of what Sheraa does gradually expanded over the years to become more of an ecosystem builder in addition to the programmatic interventions that we have today. So I'm personally very excited to have our panelists here with us today. They're in their own rights, each an expert in a specific topic. So perhaps what I wanted to do is to start by introducing every one of our panelists, and then I'll allow them 2 minutes or so to introduce their backgrounds and why this is a topic that is of interest to them. First of all, Tavvi, perhaps we can start with you. Tavvi is the former Prime Minister of Estonia and has done amazing work within the Estonian ecosystem to develop it and to incorporate more technology within the government. Tavvi, I leave it to you to give us a bit of a background.
Well, thank you very much for this. Thank you very much for this invitation to be here. And I want to say that Estonia, even though we are very far north, we are very similar in many aspects to Sharjah, probably the most similar country in the north, both in terms of population, GDP per capita, all of that. So also diversified economy, lots of things. The main lesson we can take from Estonia is that people actually have better things to do than visit public offices for interacting with them. So taking government digital has helped a lot, not only to make citizens' life easier, but also to make business climate easier. And I think that first of all, UAE is by far the most digitalized and most economically free country in the region. That goes without saying. But I think that even the best can always become better. And I think it's worth learning from each other what can we do in order to cope with the next level of digitalization. And I don't think that there is any country in the world, be it UAE, be it Estonia, be it anything else, that is finally ready for the digitalization. There will always be room for improvement. And I'm very much arguing with everybody who says that people don't want to use digital or people are not able to use digital. I mean, all of you in the room have mobile phones, and all of you in the room are actually using most of the private sector services already digitally. So why should government be any different? And I think this is the main lesson we can take, and of course Estonia has a lot to learn from Georgia as well. It's very impressive what you have achieved there.
And I must congratulate you at the work that you've done during your term, because during the few years that you were Prime Minister, you have had amazing impact in branding Estonia as e-Estonia, and you've had engagements with a lot of different global ecosystems globally on the global front. And while I was doing the research, I found an interview that you did on Trevor Noah, and honestly, it's those kinds of engagements within the ecosystem that brings people from outside the ecosystem and have them become more involved.
Yes, well, thank you for that. And I think that countries with such a small population, like Estonia, but also like Sharjah, we need something to be known for. I mean, everybody knows the United States, everybody knows for China, Russia, some of the things that they are known for are positive, some of them are negative, but most of the really small countries are not known globally.
Yeah.
And that's why we need to work hard to create our brand and to really be good at something.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for that. Areije, we have you next. Areije is a senior VP at the Bahrain Development Bank and is the fund manager of Al-Waha Fund of Funds. Areije, perhaps you can give us a bit of a background about your work with Al-Waha, and honestly, she's known as one of the few women who was behind the transformation of the Bahraini ecosystem. So perhaps a bit of background to start off with.
Sure, thank you, Eman, and it's a pleasure to be here and part of this Sharjah Entrepreneurship Festival. I have a background in banking predominantly and spent the last 10 years of my career within the ecosystem development through the Bahrain Development Bank. Very much like any other sort of country within the region, we've been working very hard on building the entrepreneurship sort of pillars and elements that help basically create an ecosystem conducive for startups to be able to thrive. Our country has been working very hard to diversify its economy more away from the traditional different industries that we've been known for. And we would like to say that successfully over the past 6 years, we've built quite a thriving entrepreneurship ecosystem, which is still in its very nascent years, but very much a collaborative environment that works very closely across the different ministries. Regulatory environment has actually thrived. And we work very hard in trying to create all the different elements to help a startup succeed. More recently, about a year and a half ago, we launched our venture capital fund of funds. Everybody knows in any ecosystem access to funding and the ability for startups to be able to have venture capital is very important, and that was sort of the ideation behind the fund of funds. Yeah. Unlike some of our peers, invested first in funds that are based out of the region and that are focusing in the region. And then as we start to develop our strategy, we are looking to create bridges across different ecosystems. Yeah. Much to my fellow panelists, being a small country, we can't say success will just be out of Bahrain. Yeah. But much more importantly, it's actually the success of being able to build companies that can expand across the region and more importantly globally, and to be able to bridge not only funding, but also access to expertise and successes that have been happening in other countries as well.
Yeah, 100%. And during the call that we had while we were prepping for this panel, I got to know you a bit more, and your foray into the entrepreneurship ecosystem, the tech startup world, is an interesting one. It wasn't by design. Perhaps you can share a bit about that with the audience.
I was very much, a very driven student, always had a plan, always knew exactly where I was going. But just before I, fell into a more government type of work, I was with Lehman Brothers. And I don't know sort of the age group here, but, everybody knows the end of Lehman. And so I became at a point where I didn't have a plan. I was very much in mainstream banking. Nobody was hiring my level. I didn't know what to do. I had nothing in front of me. And about a year and a half later, this opportunity came. But during that time, I was faced by societal pressure. What are you doing at home? Oh, I thought you were really smart. Oh, wasn't she educated? All of those things that kind of don't fit in, because you usually are told that every time what you study, you go to university, everything is smooth sailing. Yeah. But no one ever talks to you, or at least nobody ever talked to me about, what if your job doesn't work out? What if you don't like what you're doing? Yeah. What do you do next? Yeah. Or do you have to stick to what you studied throughout your whole entire life, and that's all you have to do? Yeah. And if anyone had actually given me that advice or talked to me about it, then I wouldn't have had, a very anxious year and a half before I started this. And I took the job thinking this is temporary, because ultimately it's not fit into my educational background. Yeah. But I very quickly found my passion of being able to help, my country, help the ecosystem, but more importantly, actually see a tangible impact in front of me. Yeah. And, looking back, I realized that although this might have not been something I studied at university or something that I planned for, so things happen in your career, and much like entrepreneurship, you can't always predict the bottom line. Yeah. But the journey will help you outline what's the best journey for you.
Absolutely. And they say you can only connect the dots looking back, not looking forward. This is very interesting, because that experience gave you insights into what the tech founders go through in terms of the pressure that they face from the society and the uncertainty they have. And I know you mentor a lot of startups and you engage with them, so that insight must be very, very valuable to them.
Yeah, of course.
Hattaf is actually joining us from the New Zealand ecosystem, but I'm proud to say he's actually a graduate of the American University of Sharjah. I said I'm going to say this in the introduction, but you're doing amazing work. You initially were part of the government of New Zealand with their venture capital fund, and then more recently you have founded your own VC. Perhaps you give us a bit of a background about that.
So where do I start? Do I start at the...
So maybe perhaps give us a background about what you're currently doing, and we can talk a bit about the New Zealand fund as well.
Okay, so we kind of spun out of the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund, and we're currently in the process of raising capital to start our own venture fund.
Yeah.
So we're really early in that journey at the moment, and have the right, moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
So if I was to talk more about New Zealand, so New Zealand is a pretty interesting place. So it's geographically isolated. It doesn't have much capital.
Yeah.
And I think back in 2002, the Labour government basically, looked at the economy and said, if we want to stay relevant and we want to stay a first world country, we need to diversify away from farming and actually get into venture and technology.
Yeah.
So in 2002, they created the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund. And the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund has actually been really, really good for the country.
Yeah.
And I think, so they were doing quite a few things. So they basically had a seed co-investment fund, which was co-investing with early stage investors. They had a venture capital fund, which was taking limited partner positions in venture capital funds. I basically got into this firm, and I got to see firsthand how New Zealand has actually built its venture capital ecosystem from the ground up.
Yeah.
And I think when I come back and I look at Sharjah and I see what you guys are doing, because New Zealand's 15, 16 years into their journey.
Yeah.
So if you use Silicon Valley as basically a benchmark,
Yeah.
Silicon Valley is actually many, many, many years in the future.
Yeah.
So the really interesting thing is that because of all the issues New Zealand has, lack of capital, very geographically isolated, a population of 4.5 million people, what they've done is actually really, really interesting. So they use the USMA Planck model to basically figure out policies to basically catalyze their ecosystem.
Yeah.
So I could really go into detail.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much detail you'd like to hear.
But yeah, actually, a point I'd like to mention is Hattaf actually went to New Zealand to study his master's, and he was planning to come back in a year. But you ended up staying there because you had a research paper that caused quite a stir.
Yeah, so I basically basically went to New Zealand to get my master's done, and part of the requirement to graduate was to get a master's thesis.
Yeah.
So my professors wanted me to do stuff which I didn't want to do. I was really interested in early stage and venture capital, so I basically replicated this research out of the US, and essentially, the research was very well received by the media, by the news, and I got published in the Journal of Applied Finance, and I caught the eye of the right people, and that's how I ended up in the New Zealand Venture Investment Fund, and it's been just a really, really exciting journey.
Yeah.
So but it's more of a hands-on, making investments, seeing what goes wrong, and basically talking to all the other government departments within, New Zealand, and seeing how they've, built this really strong, vibrant ecosystem. It's just really happy.
And how you adapt essentially the global benchmark to see you to the local context, which is a piece that's very important that I want to delve into a bit deeper as the conversation continues. And last but most certainly not least, we have Travis. Travis actually manages the MIT REAP program, which I first learned about when we visited, I want to say about a year and a half ago. We were part of a delegation that came from Sharjah to MIT to learn about all of the interesting work that you're doing. Perhaps we can give the audience a bit of a background about REAP and the work that you do.
Yeah. So REAP stands for the MIT Regional Entrepreneurship Acceleration Program. We work with about 16 regions around the world concurrently, and how they support their innovation ecosystem from a very systematic level. So we engage with teams that represent government, corporate, risk capital, entrepreneur, and university. And we work with them for 2 years to essentially analyze what we call their innovation-driven entrepreneurial ecosystem, identify bottlenecks or challenge areas for people to start and scale companies in those regions, and then address it through changes in laws, new policies, programs, things that are very kind of apt or very specific to that challenge in that cultural and situational context. So we've worked with over 51 different countries or regions at this point. Regions can kind of be ambiguous in a way, right? We can work with multiple cities that are neighboring. We can work with one really large city. We can work with a country. The idea is we want to work with a region that has a well-defined comparative advantage. And sometimes that is at a country level. Sometimes it's not, right? And so I think we'll get into this a little bit because the UAE and then each one of the kind of like states within the UAE, each one has their own regional comparative advantage. We want to kind of figure out how to capitalize on what each region is excellent at and what they've developed, right, over the past 60, 80 plus years.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you for that. So perhaps let's delve into the first topic of discussion that I want to bring up, which is funding. Funding perhaps is one of the things that attracts the most conversation in terms of the media spotlight, in terms of what startups complain about the lack of, in terms of how you actually measure the success of the ecosystem is about how much investment their startups want to take. And I know every one of you actually represents a different perspective on that topic. Areije, perhaps you can start with you managing the fund of funds. Perhaps you can talk to us a bit about the impact since the launch about a year and a half ago that it has had on the Bahraini ecosystem.
I think, especially from a government perspective, sometimes it can be very tough to be able to start to measure the impact that comes with such programs. A lot of people might view government as being charity, or there's a lot of sense of entitlement that comes along that, we need to get this funding because this is given by government in Bahrain and I'm here in Bahrain, etc. But I think ultimately it's very important for us to outline what the ecosystem or the where you are actually operating actually requires. And I think for us, we work very closely to ensure that there's a lot of knowledge transfer that we actually see. So actually the interaction of the networks of people that we actually invest into. So not only are we providing them with funding, but it's actually a two-way relationship. Yeah. What can these funds do for us? And we can argue that usually fund managers or asset managers are more focused on trying to basically create returns for their LPs. But sometimes you will find those synergies between people who are actually believe in the region, believe in what we're trying to create, and see the opportunity. Yeah. So ultimately, most people that are in this industry won't mind spending a few hours talking to entrepreneurs and telling them, they're on the wrong track and how to actually grow their company. Yeah. But also these kind of interaction is where fund managers actually meet potential, fund companies that they actually invest in. Yeah. And so we're happy to say that, we've gotten a lot of good feedback from the managers that we've invested in, because we've created a little mini ecosystem between us and the fund managers, and ultimately engaging them in the companies that we have within the ecosystem. Yeah. And Bahrain likes to operate very seamlessly between the different sort of decision makers. So because a lot of these companies are operating in a new space and these fund managers potentially are expanding their companies into Bahrain, you need to have access to the people that will allow the regulation to allow these companies to operate. Yeah. So being able to have access to that and to create a friendly environment is very important. Yeah. But we've seen investments being made in companies. We've seen a lot of companies pivot or change their focus because they've had access to mentorship or to people that have actually done this before. We we were just speaking about this before we came on the panel, that although that this region is thriving and we have seen some successes, but ultimately, success reaps success because you see them as role models. People will look up to them, but they'll actually feel like they need to see it tangible, that it's happened in Bahrain or it's happened in countries that are like Bahrain. Yeah. Because if I'm going to be talking about something that's happening, miles away, although it is very inspiring, it's hard to relate. Yeah. And we always look for role models that we can relate to, that we want to aspire to. So I think not only are we just trying to fund, but we're also looking at how it impacts our ecosystem. Yeah. And it's a challenging job, because how do you balance between both? Yeah. But I think there's a lot of discipline that comes around with it, and ensuring that, like, when an investor looks at a startup when they're actually investing in them, to ensure there's a synergy between the chemistry and the personalities and the goals that each one wants out of the other. Yeah. That's the same kind of approach we have when we invest into funds. Yeah,
which is a very important point about maintaining these channels of communication very open and very transparent with everyone. I've had the chance to attend 2 events in Bahrain this year alone. One of them was the Gen Global Congress, and the other one was when Sheraa joined the Global Accelerators Network. And I have to say, the way that the ecosystem in Bahrain operates is genuinely very seamless. It's very open. There's a lot of collaboration that takes place, which is key to the success of initiatives like Al-Waha Fund. So yeah, I just had to say that. Hattaf, during our conversation, we actually had a conversation about New Zealand's experience and how they had jumped into the funding approach prior to establishing the necessary framework of angel investment, where the deal flow is actually going to come from. Perhaps we can discuss that a bit.
Yeah, so I guess if I was to summarize the key learning from NZVIF, so NZVIF has been really, really successful, and I think, but they obviously looking back, there are things that they could have done differently.
Yeah.
So I guess the key learning from NZVIF's experience, from New Zealand's experience, was that what New Zealand did was they basically thought that the angels are going to figure stuff out themselves, and the focus was on venture capital from day one. Just fund the venture capital guys, the deal flow's there, angels are going to manage it, and we will all make money. And the ecosystem will thrive, the GDP will go up. The issue that they faced was, which is why there has been a second intervention now. So I think the policy might be passed within 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So now we have a second intervention because of this. So what happened was, in practice, is the VC arm got funded first, and then the seed co-investment fund came 5 years after. And because there was, so if you leave angels to their own devices in a nascent ecosystem, angels will, fund what they like to fund. And it's not necessary that they and the VCs will actually agree on, is this the right deal to be funded? So they had an issue with deal flow. And as a consequence, most of the VC funds that got funded lost money because they were forced to deploy cash, and they were forced to invest in maybe startups that weren't ready, maybe had a strategy which was guided by an angel's opinion. So that was one of the biggest lessons, if NZVIF, in its history, was they should have focused on the angel ecosystem as well as the venture ecosystem. So ignoring the angel side of things is not, that's kind. And then as a consequence, what happened was, because the VCs lost money, the track record for the ecosystem was poor. So the VCs struggled to raise money from institutions, which is why now we have a second intervention. So if there's one lesson to be learned when you're building an ecosystem from scratch, is to not just focus on venture, but the angel is also super important.
Yeah. And Travis, when during our conversation, during your work in REAP, you get exposed to heaps of data.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of interesting perspectives that develop. And during our conversation, I actually mentioned the New Zealand experience to you, as you had some interesting perspectives about the relationships and the timelines between angels and VCs. Perhaps you can share a bit of that with the audience.
Absolutely. So one of the things that we've found is that if you have an angel community that's not well connected or is missing linkages, they don't build a community, they can often miss what their region's really good at. And they invest in things that they see as successful outcomes in other regions that they might be exposed to. And they're not really investing in what the comparative advantage of that region is. And what that in turn ends up doing, to Hattaf's point, is later on, when those angels are going to be bought out by VCs, the VCs have a harder time sourcing deals locally, and they'll actually have to invest lower dollar amounts in earlier stage ventures to make up for the angel community not being able to support those ventures at those earlier stages. And so there becomes this kind of awkward kind of bottleneck between the angels and then the VCs. And so in order to kind of build a strong and healthy venture community, you want to try to connect that, right? You want to be able to provide opportunities for angels to be able to kind of have cash out parties, right? And get excited about having a community around investment in their region and how that connects to the broader capital markets, right? And so when you think about kind of risk capital in your region, think about what the role of VCs are in relation to later stage capital providers.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, specifically for more nascent ecosystems, such as what we're trying to build here in Sharjah. Those insights are quite valuable and quite key in order to accelerate our success. Tavvi, I want to go to you now. We were just talking right before the panel about the impact that huge success stories, such as Skype, for example, we've had the founder speak at the main stage earlier today about the appetite of investors to invest in startups and about how these success stories impact the ecosystem in general, also from an entrepreneur side, in order to get more into the mindset of launching a tech company. Perhaps we can talk about that a bit.
For a very small country like Estonia, before Skype, creating a multi-billion dollar company seemed like something you only see in CNN.
Yeah.
So it's not possible in Estonia, of course,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas when Skype was quite quickly with 4 Estonians and 2 foreigners, 6 people in Estonia, creating a company with just a couple of years worth 8.5 billion.
Yeah.
The biggest impact was not the money, it was the knowing that it can be done right here. It's not only in the US, it's not only in the big countries, it can be done right here. And from that on, I would say that most of the key players in Estonian startup ecosystem have some sort of connection with Skype. Founders, ex-employees, investors, something like that. The other thing, which I think is relevant also in this region, is that once there are success stories, the same investors keep coming back.
Yeah.
Tim Draper from Draper Associates was an early investor in Skype, and he has since invested in several Estonian companies. Ben Horowitz from Andreessen Horowitz invested in TransferWise, and now he has invested in other companies as well. The connections, the knowing that things happen in this particular region,
Yeah.
hugely important. And third point was what was talking about New Zealand's experience. I think that government intervention is not necessarily a bad thing in this, because it depends on a region. For example, in Estonia we have angel scenery very good. I would say that those guys who have already exited, including the Skype founders, but many others, they are actually bringing back the seed money, or not even like angel investing money to the community. But we did have, a few years ago, have a problem with Series A and even seed money. So their government had a patch of 120 million euros, and in the ticket sizes of 20 to 25 millions, handed them to VCs. And VCs then co-invested this money alongside with their own money and what they raised from pension funds and other institutionals. And that created a huge difference. So Estonia came from very small amount of investments to like around 300 and 400 million euros annually to Estonian startups, which I think is quite considerable.
Yeah.
And bringing that money, in some cases it could be like there is lack of angel, in some cases it would be lack of growth capital. In Estonia, we have decided that we don't even try to get growth capital from domestic market because we don't have that much money. We then, if you're so big already, go to Silicon Valley, go to London, you will get the money from there.
Yeah, it's that network effect that is key, and it's extremely important. So when you have these massive success stories, it ends up breeding more success at the end of the day. But it's key to actually have a mindset of wanting to develop the ecosystem that you came from, wanting to pay it forward and wanting to co-create it with them. And then on that topic of mindset and culture, Areije, I want to ask you perhaps your thoughts about the culture in the MENA region. In general, there are very specific key components that are important in terms of openness and willingness to collaborate and connectivity and being so hospitable and flexible. But there are still a couple of things that perhaps generally as a region we want to work on combating that actually might hinder the progress of an ecosystem, and what are the things that we should work on developing?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't hear it was to me. I think we can go talk about this for a long time, but we only have 2 minutes left. But I think, it's really important to understand that, like anything, you need to find people who think like you and you work with them. Yeah. I think the first time I connected with, Sheraa was, I heard Nejla speak once at a panel, she heard me speak on a panel, and ultimately there is that kind of, overlap in the way that you think. I think, like anything in life, there's always going to be challenges. There's always going to be time for things to change. Yeah. But it's always about people plowing through. And then once they see a few people working together and success coming out of it, then, a lot of people will start doing it. Like anything we do in life, you were just speaking about Skype. It happened in Estonia. Now a lot of people will believe that, and have believed that they can create companies out of their ecosystems. And I think, because it's something new. So there was, if I look back 10 years ago and people would say entrepreneurship or start their business, people would say, oh my God, this person is crazy. Why did they do this? poor parents, they spent so much money on their education and now they're wasting all of it away. And now 10 years later, you know, you see people say, look at him or look at her. She started her own business. She took it to another level. She's not just working in a government job. So we have to be patient, like, you know, patient capital when we're in venture, but also be patient at the fact that, you know, things need to take its course. We're lucky because we have learnings, you know. A lot of the work that we did out of Bahrain and what I did within the bank didn't happen because I had been to Silicon Valley. I actually first went to Silicon Valley only in 2018, which was just a year ago. And so people would be shocked, but ultimately, you know, I didn't have to go somewhere else to create what my ecosystem needed, or our ecosystem needed, but I think now I can go and learn what they've done and take back what, you know, sort of was their struggles and not try to re-implement it within 100%. Our ecosystems. And, you know, Bahrain looks up to, you know, ecosystems like Estonia because, again, with size and regulation, very fast and nimble. So I think it's to have the open mind to be able to not have your ego stand in the way to learn from others that have done it well. And to also be proud when you do well and be happy with the others that are doing well rather than focus on like who's doing it first, who put it in the news first. You know, it's not about that. It's really like take on what you think you can implement and if it works, great, but also celebrate the successes because our region needs to work together and if the region succeeds, we succeed. And, you know, and then we can then potentially become a region that exports technology rather than be the consumers of technology.
And I'm quite optimistic that we're definitely on that route with a lot of great initiatives that are happening. I think our time's up right now. All of us, I think, have mentioned that this is a topic that we can have like an entire day to discuss it and we still won't be done. I just wanted to take a minute to thank my fellow panelists here for their generosity with sharing their information and therefore their generosity with their time and being here. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.